We are live. Hello, everybody. Welcome to The Reason We Learn. This is our live stream. I am welcoming to the channel my friend and teacher, Philadelphia school teacher, Christopher Paslay. He's also the author of Exploring White Fragility, which is a great book that you absolutely should read. I'm going to write it down for you. So he and you tell us about your background, Chris, for those who don't know. He also has a YouTube channel, by the way.
Sure. So I've been teaching in Philadelphia for 24 years. My dad taught for like 36 years, so it's in the family. I'm a coach. I'm a track coach. I have a master's in multicultural education, which I got in back in 2011, and it's completely changed around. Multiculturalism is so different now with what's going on. Of course, I wrote this book, Exploring White Fragility, which debates the effects of whiteness studies on America's schools, which is what we're going to, I guess, talk about white identitarianism. So it's kind of plugged into that. And I have my YouTube channel where I go over a lot of the things that you talk about in different ways and different other kinds of topics. But I guess mine is more framed through the whiteness scholarship, whiteness study scholarship. But I still get into the critical race theory and the other things. So I've been very much.
That's the channel.
I've been paying attention to it. And I'm kind of really like, some people are like, wow, you're kind of not obsessed with it, but I'm really paying attention to it because I find it really interesting. So that's kind of me.
Right. Yeah. And I, we kind of, it's interesting because when we make videos, we tend to kind of come at similar topics, almost like without even discussing it with each other. It's like, we'll be talking about similar stuff, but your perspective is somebody in the classroom. And also, with that background, that expertise of multiculturalism that the multicultural education, so you can bring that experience to the conversation, which I think is so valuable. I come at it a little bit more from like the side of a parent and somebody who's taking more historical perspective, maybe of just the totality of it. So it's a little different. But today I asked Chris to come here and talk to me and talk to all of us because there's been a lot of heat generated by the topic of critical race theory and all of its associated fields, right? Because it's not just CRT, right? It's just critical pedagogy, which also talks about, intersectionality, whiteness studies, all those things. So let's not get hung up on names, okay? But the way that our culture is moving, and specifically how it's manifesting in schools, there's been a lot of heat generated by the side, and I say side, but people who say, it's anti-white. It's anti-white. This rhetoric, this pedagogy, this whole worldview is anti-white. And then there's a school of thought that says, don't say it's anti-white because you're going to inspire identity politics or white identity amongst white people who, for a nice long while, ever since the civil rights movement at the very least, have not really seen themselves as white people, like have been kind of like, just people or Americans, and not really felt the need to have kind of a racial identity. Whereas before the civil rights movement, maybe they did. And then that was somewhat of a problem, right? There were sort of us, them kind of characteristics. And then you have sort of people in the middle. And I kind of would consider myself a person straddling those two areas where I have eyes, I have ears, and I read the rhetoric and I hear the rhetoric and I see some of the proponents of these ideas, and they are clearly anti-white. There's like, you can't say otherwise. Like, they're literally saying, I hate white people, or like, white people are fill in the blank. They're stereotyping. They're espousing extremely racist viewpoints. They're doing all the things you would call anti-black if they were saying black instead of white, except it's flipped around, right? So the individual behaviors, the words, the rhetoric, even some of the lesson plans where they say white oppression, white this, whiteness, white space, white tears. This is, there's no way to sugarcoat it. It's clearly anti-white people. And however, so I acknowledge that. I see that. Eyes and ears. I'm not stupid. But on the other hand, I also see everything else that it's trying to accomplish. I've read all the background, the postmodernist, origins of this. And I also understand that it's a ploy, that's not all it is. It's also incredibly racist against everyone else. It's extremely intolerant of anyone who disagrees with them, whether they're white, black, or Hispanic, or it doesn't matter. If you disagree, you're suddenly just as bad as any, white person. In fact, you are now effectively white. You're a white supremacist.
Right.
And they've conflated whiteness with the Enlightenment universalist values, the universal values that were part of the American creed, the American project, if you will. They've now sort of slandered with this negative connotation of whiteness, which they then tie to white supremacy. And my view is, and tell me if you agree, they've done that intentionally to smear all the things they're trying to destroy to make it easier to destroy them. That their project is destroy the American creed. Well, we got to make it associated with something ugly. So let's do that. What do you think? Am I off base?
I think it's partially correct. I think it's about identity politics, like you said. And I think when you're talking about critical race theory, critical whiteness studies, and this pushback, the one thing that's not true is that it's only conservatives. This idea that only conservatives are pushing back isn't true, because if you look at school boards, if you look at, things that are being written, you have moderates who don't agree. You have traditional liberals, like Helen Pluckrose just was talking about this. She wrote Cynical Theories with James Lindsay, and Helen Pluckrose considers herself a traditional liberal. And she's like, I don't agree with this stuff. So it's not just, it's, I don't think this pushback is a partisan thing, but what you were talking about whiteness and this idea of whiteness, the difficult thing is, how do you define it? What is it exactly? You could say that it's against white culture or white people, and then some will argue that whiteness has nothing to do with people and culture. It's an argument over semantics, but it definitely is targeting a group of people. You have to admit that. And the idea of whiteness, like the title of this piece is The Problem. What's the title? The Problem
with Trouble with White Identity.
The Trouble with White Identity. So it's troubling because you could look at it from many different angles. I think traditionally, white people, white America, do want to take the Martin Luther King approach, at least of the last 50 or 60 years, of the colorblindness. Let's just refer to the content of character. Let's be individuals. Let's not get caught up in identity. And the argument that you have to see color, I think most people will say we can see color, we can see our identities, and we can move past it, and we can look at the substance and connect on a deeper level. But the more that people in society want to move past identity politics, there's a lot of, it's very political, and identity politics are like the bread and butter of a lot of different political groups. Like you could say people left of center definitely benefit from identity politics. So they always say you have to keep race on the table. D'Angelo Kennedy says you have to keep race on the table. If you don't keep race on the table, you don't look at the world through the lens of race, then racism is going to continue. And I don't agree with that, because if you have principles, morals, values, skills, and you're open-minded and you're tolerant, you're going to see racism, even if you don't keep race on the table in this kind of obsessive way. So, but here's the problem: when white America, or even just general Americans, you don't have to be white. If you want to try and say, let's look at the content of character and move past race, you can't seem to do it. It's being projected onto people. This idea of whiteness studies, just really quickly, and I write about this in the book. Critical whiteness scholarship tries to look at, there's 3 tenets to it. One is that it looks at the fact that whiteness studies can be viewed as being concerned with the supposed invisibility of white identity, that whites don't see themselves as having a race, or that race doesn't matter. The understanding of white privilege, whether or not whites are aware of their so-called privilege and privileged status in society, and the belief in colorblindness and individualism. So like people like D'Angelo and critical whiteness scholars are forcing you to say, whiteness isn't invisible. We have to keep race on the table. White people have to understand that others don't have the luxury of saying that you can just look at content of character. So it's like almost being projected onto people. So in a way, it's like you don't really have a choice. Right. You want to let it go, but it's like, how do you let it go when it's constantly being kept on the table and projected onto people?
Well, and when the thing that you were taught, or at least I was taught and brought up to not do, like not see myself as white person, right?
Right.
That was part of the color blindness, that, I wasn't supposed to see myself as other, or to not other people. Like you're not supposed to other others. And that when somebody tells you, well, that's part of your privilege, like you just said, well, you don't have to. I have to see myself in this way, or other people are going to force me to see myself as my color or my culture. And you have the luxury of not being able to, or of not having to do that. And so it feels and I could be wrong. I'm just expressing how it feels to me. So this is just kind of a perception thing, not truth. My perception is there's a little bit of a, you know, evening things out. Like, I don't like how I felt. Yeah, I don't like how I felt. So you need to feel the same as me. I feel like there's a little bit of a desire to turn the tables of power so that to shift, because we know that critical theory teaches that life is a series of power struggles and zero-sum games. And so that I feel a little bit that this is like, in order to flip the power the other way so that it, you've had it for too long. Now we have to take, it's our turn kind of thing, that the only way to do that is to other people who, like, the way they feel they've been othered. It's a little bit of revenge. It's like a revenge kind of a thing, or retribution, resentment. I don't feel like there's a positive to it, is my point. And as much as I understand the frustration, look, I feel it. I have to discipline myself when I see Mark Lamont Hill go off on Chris Rufo, and I see, Joy Reid, and and listen to some of the things she says. And there's that little piece of us. I mean, if we're honest, there's a piece inside of me that says, I'm sick of this crap. Yeah. Like, I'm seriously sick of this crap. And keep at this. And it's going to be harder and harder for me to not think ugly thoughts. Right. And I'm being honest. I'm just being brutally honest here. But of course, your rational mind kicks in and you say, that's what they want you to do. Stop it, Deb. That's exactly what they want you to do. They want you to go there. They're poking you. It's like a bait. And because they're already telling you, the proponents of this worldview are saying, you're racist by default. You're racist and there's white supremacy, all this. And they're waiting for you to react in a way that is characteristically racist, or to say something or do something, or, kind of be pushed over that cliff. They go, aha, see, it was just simmering below the surface. It was just waiting to come up. And I think to myself, like, no, there are things that people react, right? They aren't simmering. People get frustrated and they get sick and tired of being called a bad person when they don't feel like they deserve it. Nobody, I don't care who you are, nobody likes to be falsely accused of anything. It's just human nature. Okay. So I feel like it's dangerous because I think it's part of the goal, like, to divide us as Americans.
Yeah. I think that there's lots of different groups involved. Like, it's like a confluence of all different groups. And some people are genuinely interested in progress. Like, I think there's really people who are genuinely interested in trying to make things better and to end systemic inequalities. And then there's people who they're opportunists. They know that they're going to use this because they're going to use it for their benefit. And some of it's political. It's an idea where you could use it as an issue to, gin up support. And it's just, there's a lot of different parts to it. Yeah. So it depends on which part you're talking about. But I think as a whole, it does have the feel of like the Marxism, where it's like divisive. It's dividing people into these groups, oppressor and oppressed. And it definitely feels like it's not about trying to find solutions. That's the one thing I always look at. I'm like, where are the solutions? Like, what is
exactly
what even Robin DiAngelo says in the beginning of her workshop, there's no magic bullet. There's not really any solution. So I'm just going to talk to you for like 3 hours and indoctrinate you and insult you, but there's no solution at the end. So it's like, what's the point? The point is to push your politics and to push your agenda. And in the end, it's like, well, what's the actual solution? If you're looking at something on an individual level and you're teaching the kids skills and you're teaching them principles and how to be critical thinkers and literacy and all this stuff, there are things that they can use to be successful, time management, anger management. But if you're teaching them in terms of systems, there's a certain part of it that's legitimate because you have to notice patterns that can be out of proportion to a certain point. But if it gets out of balance and it's just all the systemic stuff, it's like, well, how do you fix the system without individual people? And in the end, it's like, where are the solutions? There aren't any. What do you go back into your classroom with? Well, you don't have much to go back in your classroom with. So what is it doing? It's indoctrinating people. It's pushing an agenda. It's political. And it's a shame because you're right. It's not, in the end, it doesn't seem like it's definitely not unifying. It's not bringing people together. You don't have any concrete, real solutions. And in the end, it just feels like people are left feeling resentful and bitter in the end. Right. Some people aren't, but some people are. A majority of people are feeling that way. And just to add one more thing, that interview that Glenn Lowry did when he brought on Charles Murray, and it was kind of controversial, but Glenn Loury was really getting into some good points. And the topic was brought up, is there's this underlying current of kind of resentment, or what's going to happen where you have everyday working class white people who are good neighbors, good workers. They have diverse neighbors and they care, but they keep hearing this over and over and over again. What's going to happen? Is there going to be some backlash? And in terms of that, I don't think there's going to be a backlash like there was with the reckoning with George Floyd in terms of protests and any kind of like violence. But I think it's all going to come down to segregation.
Right.
I think that what's going to happen, and they talked about this, when people get resentful, they're just going to resegregate themselves, or they're going to want to segregate out. And it's going to be like, okay, well, then I'm just going to kind of go into my little area. And I think the irony is we're trying to promote diversity, but you're causing segregation. We're trying to end race essentialism, but they're using race essentialism. We're trying to deconstruct race, which is a social construct, but yet they're strengthening the social construct as they want to get rid of it. It's just, to me, it's like completely backwards, and it's a hypocrisy.
Totally. And as what Chris is talking about is this podcast that Glenn did with Charles Murray based on his new book. And I think he has it. I think Free Black Thought covered this, and they said, this is pretty funny. He says, "What is the threat from the right?" And I don't love the use of right versus left. I don't think that that paradigm works anymore. As you pointed out, it's not just people on the right who are opposed to critical race theory or any of its offshoots. It's people, I would say, who have a more colorblind view of America, who have a more classically liberal view of America, who believe in the American creed and the American project and so forth. And yes, also a large percentage of white working class and middle class people who are not already in sort of the elite academic, echelons or whatever. So he says, this is where disaster is looming the closest. I'm worried about all of the working class and middle class whites. And then he says, who've had it beaten into their, they can't turn on the TV without yet another reference to the fact that they're bad people, that they have white privilege. What is the proportion of that 60% who are getting really pissed? What is the proportion of them who are, and here's where the danger is, Glenn, starting to say to themselves, well, guess what? I'm an identity too. You want to play identity politics? Okay, we can go with that playbook. It's a much more racially grounded fight than it was before. And that's the danger, I think, is that if people decide to go with that playbook, now the majority population and the minority population are working on a different project than the American project. The American project, as imperfect as it was, for years and years, we've been steadily making progress. But the goal, the aspiration was to a pluralistic, colorblind society where we're all equal under the law, where people are literally intermarrying and it's like, where the color of your skin is just this little factoid about you that might be relevant to your doctor and a police officer if they're looking for you. For good or bad. It's like you're missing and they need to find you, whatever. But other than that, it wouldn't be dispositive. It wouldn't determine anything about you. That was sort of the goal, that it would be something about you, but it wouldn't be relevant to judgments that people make about you that would put up barriers in your life. But once we get into the racialized view of ourselves, and we all do it. So then the next thing that people will say to me, for example, if I start going down this path and explaining my viewpoint, and they'll say, but they do it. But how is that fair? What about there's the Black Caucus and the historically black colleges and the NAACP and, affinity groups and this and that and the other. And how come it's right? Blah, 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 blah. And I have an unusual answer. I don't think it is. It's legal. It's obviously legal, freedom of association, private associations, private colleges, you can do these things. But do I think it is helpful to the long-term success of the country and the republic? I think we need to care that each time people form that kind of affinity group, they need to be very careful and thoughtful about how and why they're doing it. And I certainly don't approve of it in public schools. That's my personal take is if you want to do that privately, knock yourself out. People do that stuff. But I don't think it has a place where we're using taxpayer dollars and we're using public institutions to encourage separation. That's my view. I don't agree with it.
I feel like you do. It's interesting when you talk about having a national American identity. Like we want to have, as Americans, we want to have a national cultural identity. Like I think that's something that is positive. It brings us together. We're all Americans. You don't have to hyphenate. You don't have to look at your specific identity according to race, religion, gender, or sexuality. We can feel like we're together as Americans. There can be this national American identity. But every time you try and go there, for some reason, it's like for people on the left, they start to talk about nationalism, and it's like, oh, you know, there's this American nationalism, and it's unhealthy to have this common American identity because it becomes this kind of American nationalism. And then they start to talk about how it's not possible to have this common culture and this common identity because everybody is so different. When you try and say we're all human and we need to come together and bond with each other on these deeper levels, there's always this pushback. Robin DiAngelo always talks about this. When you say universal human values or we're all human, there's a pushback. There was a presentation that I just did a video about in Iowa, and it was this slide that showed that there was these kinds of overt white supremacy, covert white supremacy, and the idea of individualism or we're all human was like racist. To say that we're all human is racist. It's sad because you can never figure out a way or find a way that we can come together and have this kind of unity, because you have to keep race on the table. It has to be about identity politics. That's like that is the tact that is taken, and it's not. I know that you need to look at systems and patterns, but when do you get past it? And at what point do you start to say, we're going to find a common bond and come together? And it doesn't seem like the left and critical race theory and critical pedagogy. I like when you did that video and you say they're not teaching critical race theory, they're using critical pedagogy, because I've used that phrase now like a million times. Mm-hmm. When they're using critical pedagogy, this idea, this critical, studies, it is divisive and it's not holistic. And I don't understand how, after noticing patterns and systems, when do you get to the solutions? When do we all come together and where do we move forward? And it doesn't ever seem to ever happen.
It's deconstruction for its own sake.
Yeah.
And, it's almost like I can't tell you what the solutions will be because I haven't deconstructed it completely yet. And we need to start over. And I think that to implement pedagogy on a basis of a theory like that's deconstructivist in that way, without demanding at least a hypothesis of what you plan to build in its place, is grossly irresponsible, not least because you're dealing again with public dollars. You're dealing with millions upon millions of school children. And, these are minor children, and you're impacting their life, and you're telling them they need to tear apart the country in which they live. The institutions are what is the country? The country isn't geography. The nation isn't, these lines around the earth. The nation is a set of ideas that bind us together, that unify us, so we're not literally at each other's throats or warring in the streets or having little warlords fighting and so forth. And the institutions that make all of that possible, sort of the institutions that we as people have decided to empower, and because we're democratic republic, we decided to empower with this sort of hands-on bureaucratic whatever of getting it done, so that our rights are presumably protected. Obviously, I know that they do way more than that, and they trample our rights. So I'm being a little ironic here, but at the same time, that's the nation. And so if you say we need to dismantle these institutions and we need to tear them down and root out, like they're just so imbued with racism, and you don't have a single solitary suggestion for like what you're going to do to replace that, or what it's going to look like, you aren't even willing to paint a picture for people of what it will look like, who will be in charge, and what will the principles be? If you don't like the Constitution, what do you propose in its place? Be honest about that. And what bothers me is that people are so terrified of being called names, they're so terrified of being canceled, that or just being called white supremacists, that they don't push back in the ways you can push back. Like the temptation is to go, oh yeah, white identity, right? Because that's easy. We hear the rhetoric. It's obviously anti-white, so it's easy to flip it around and go, okay, well, back on you. But instead, we should be saying, I'm not playing your game. I'm not doing your thing. You don't get to do what you say you're going to do without these kind of, preconditions. So I feel still, even when I see these courageous parents go up and say, please don't use this in the classroom, please don't do this, there's so much about it that feels like they're begging. That sounds like they're still subservient to the people who are their public servants. And part of that, I believe, is this fear. And I just really worry, because when you operate from a position of fear for too long and your back is up against a wall, that's when people go, that, like Charles Murray's worried about it. That's when people say, I'm done. I'm done. There's no more discussing it anymore. And I agree with him. I don't think it's going to become this aggressive, people fighting and stuff. But I do think people are just going to relocate. You're going to have a resegregation of society. You're going to have people saying, oh, you want to force me and my company to hire X percentage of minorities, and I can't do that without lowering my hiring standards to a level where I'm not going to be profitable, or I'm not going to be able to function. I'm just going to be floating that person because they don't have the requisite skills and I need to hire someone now. I'm going to move to where there's almost no Black people. And then that way, you're going to find me. It's not my fault. I can't find any employees. They don't live here. And then if they try to press it even further, if they try to really coerce you into doing it or paying a fine, because we all know it's going to be a revenue generating tool. It's not going to be about really employing Black people. It's going to be about generating revenue for the federal government in the form of fines. Like with Obamacare, that's what that was. They weren't so much concerned about people being insured as collecting those fines. So then people in those states are going to elect legislators and governors who are going to go, nah, sanctuary state. Where you want to have your sanctuary city? We're going to have a sanctuary city, sanctuary state. We're not enforcing your little federal regulations about hiring. We're not playing that equity game. There aren't enough people here with the right skills. We need to have functioning economy. Run along. And that's not good for America.
That sanctuary state is interesting. I remember him saying that, like sanctuary cities now, but sanctuary states in kind of that different way where you're not going to follow these specific rules. And when you're talking about hiring and different things like that, and you look at the broad spectrum of different skills, it's like everybody has their strengths and weaknesses. And the best thing is to try and fit people with with their skills and do the things that they can do with their strengths. But it's not always just going to come out the way that they say it's supposed to on paper. But when you said about people being afraid and there's kind of a silent majority or there's an undercurrent, the thing that I noticed, and I think it's refreshing, in 1 year, if you look at July of 2020 and you look at July or coming up July of 2021, the amount of people who seem to be able to speak out freely about things, it's gotten much more open. Because last year at this time, it was really kind of locked down with what you could say. People were afraid to say different things, even criticize things. And there was more of this idea of canceling, and because tensions were higher, the George Floyd, death happened and there wasn't a trial yet. And Trump was there, and whatever you feel about Trump, but it's like now, Donald Trump's not in office, and Mark Chauvin, or I forget the guy's exact name.
I think it's Derek Chauvin.
Yeah, my thought. Derek Chauvin, he's now in jail. So it's like, now the smoke's settled, and now it's like everybody is seeing exactly what's going on, and more people are able to talk about it rationally without having as much tension, because school boards and just people writing about it and talking about it. And I think that it is coming back up. The pendulum is swinging the other way. It was really, really systemic. Everything is systemic. And now it's kind of saying, well, there is some more individual, control in it at the center of it.
I think you're right. I think people are starting to learn. The concern I have in terms of education is how much longer they've been embedding these ideas into the curriculum, all the way, from the university, college, everything, into the minds of the teachers, into the classroom. And then, of course, all the books that are being put out, even in our federal institutions and departments. I mean, the National Archives now has a whole, race task force to like revamp everything about the National Archives, including the Rotunda, by the way. So it feels like they've been working on this project for quite some time. And I just did another live today on my own because I couldn't get my software to work about North Carolina specifically, and how just deeply embedded this like social emotional learning and equity and anti-racism and all these things, to the point where I sincerely believe that our superintendent of public instruction and our lieutenant governor, both of whom are sort of in charge of this, right? Really don't know. Like, I think that even they don't realize how like the spider web has spread out to the point where, you know, when they're asked about it, they're like, well, no, of course we don't support critical race theory, but it isn't there. And we say no and all this. And it's like, but it is.
Right.
But it is. I mean, I know you're saying it's not there because you don't see it at the top level, but it's this, it's this, it's this, it's this. It's like all these different little pieces. And it manifests as, or in the minds of a lot of people, as a specifically attacking. So there are different kinds of negative. There's infantilizing your students by having low expectations for them and telling them they're victims. That's obviously very negative and racist, in my opinion.
Sure.
And then there's the overt, in your face, you're not good because you're white, you know, like, and so I think people are reacting to the overt and they're missing the covert.
Right.
They're missing the undermining, the infantilization, the parentification, and all these different things that are going on that actually disproportionately impact minority students, if you think about it. I mean, the people who are less, first of all, may not speak English as a first language. Secondly, maybe they are, you know, working more hours or more jobs or whatever, and they just simply don't have the time to engage with this material in quite the same way. And they may be from a lower socioeconomic level or so forth, because that tends to be more aligned with minority populations, not exclusively, but, and so what happens is, if you are white, middle class, or working class and above, and this stuff is going on and you see it, you might be more likely to address it, redress it, get your kid out, like all those things, right? But it's still negative for the other kids left behind. It's actually really, really bad for them. And they may not be as adept at getting out from under it. So I guess my point is, it's not a contest. It's not about who has it worse. It's just to say it's bad for everyone. And so where I do align with the people who say, don't say it's anti-white, it's not, wouldn't use those words. I wouldn't use say, don't say it. I'm just saying, be careful when you say that. Be careful what you're saying it about.
Yeah.
What and whom. Be very, very specific. Yes, the rhetoric is clearly. And that means that if you're a person who is white and you hear this rhetoric, it's going to sound like an attack to you because you're a human being. And words like white people are bad is an attack. Okay. If it's an attack to say even the smallest little microaggression, like, where were you from? To someone who's black, or, you know, where are your ancestors from? If that's an attack, then white people are bad is certainly an attack. So I'm not going to deny people their frustration and their anger when they're being specifically attacked. What I'm just going to say is be thoughtful, because I do think that all of these pedagogies are anti everything that you care about. They're way more than anti-white. They're anti-American.
Sure.
They're just straight up. That's my take.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up some of the kids with challenges. A lot of times the kids who need the most help, and sometimes, like, you know, students of color have more challenges and they come out of certain areas. And it seems to always be with these kind of left of center or more of a radical policy. Those are the kids that get hurt the most. If you look at the most popular policies, it always ends up being the kids who need the most help are the ones who get hurt the most by it. I don't know how you can have high expectations. Like, I don't understand when you teach this stuff as a teacher, especially the new pre-service teachers and the new teachers that are coming out, when they see these kids in terms of these groups and things. Supposedly they're supposed to see all this stuff, so they have high expectations. Like, they want to get rid of the implicit bias and the microaggressions, and they want to make sure that they're able to see everybody and teach them in a way that's equitable. But it's just like everything else. You're using race essentialism to get rid of it. You're trying to get rid of race as a social construct by strengthening it. The teachers, when you teach like this, because I've been there and I've heard about it and I can see it and I try it, and it's like your expectations immediately shift. And it's like, instead of teaching a student as a student, we're going to teach you how to write a thesis statement. We're going to teach you how to be an active listener. All of a sudden, it's like this subgroup and this subgroup, and why isn't it exactly the same? And what are you going to do? It's like, well, what do you want me to do? How am I going to teach a black student a thesis statement as opposed to a white student a thesis statement? And then it's like you never get an answer. But the expectations and I think it has a factor on the kids. Plus, it's watering down the curriculum. The kids aren't getting the skills and the rigor of instruction because it's getting watered down, and you're bringing in more and more politics, which is divisive. And then kids are literally being indoctrinated to believe certain things. Like I remember, and I wrote about it in the book, Exploring White Fragility, certain kids don't believe that they can achieve the American dream because they've been indoctrinated to believe that. That's sad.
It's
you know what I
really
mean?
sad. Yeah.
It's a shame. It's
I think that's racist.
Yeah.
Like I just do. And I mean, and that's the problem is, you know, if we get stuck, if we get hung up on the anti-whiteness aspects of it, we will forget the totality of it, which is that it is straight up racist, period. And more importantly than that, even it's collectivist. Right. So you see, like all racism is collectivism. Not all collectivism is racism, but all racism is collectivism. There's no question about it. And I firmly believe that the use of race in this particular case is as a tool. I don't think, you know, for all the talk about why didn't the civil rights movement achieve as, you know, more than it achieved.
A political tool?
Yes. I think if you really believed that the only just society was one that was more Marxist, like it was more Marxian, and you knew that in the American psyche was so deeply ingrained this notion of, you know, sort of a kind of equality under the law, and, you know, unequal outcomes going to happen because individualism, right? If you knew that, and that upward mobility was easier here than in 90% of the planet, okay, you couldn't really, as much as we do have classes. I mean, we know there's classes here. We're not going to lie about it. And we know that meritocracy is not a sure thing. Right. We know there will always be nepotism, and we know there are going to be people who get promoted because they're prettier or they're funnier or whatever. We know this.
And you have limited abilities as well.
Yeah, we know. And we know that it's not a sure thing that like, oh, you achieve the highest, you have the best scores, and you're the smartest person, you will get the most. That's pure meritocracy. And I don't think any of us are so naive as to believe that merit in America was pure. Okay. But I think most of us felt like it was far better here than in places where classism and caste type systems were more deeply ingrained. And that's part of why people came here from all these other countries, was to find the place on the planet where they had the greatest likelihood, not a guarantee, but the greatest likelihood of rising up from their circumstance to get to more. So Marxism doesn't really sell all that well in that environment. And it especially doesn't sell in a country that has a steady stream of immigrants coming from places that used to have socialism, you know, or had that and don't want it anymore. So, but if you're an intellectual, the type of person who really believed, and it's taken me a long time to understand that these people exist because I can't wrap my mind around it. But if you really truly believe the old "they didn't do it right" argument, and you still were a utopian and you still felt like, I bet we can do it right this time. I bet if we did it here, it would be better. Right. The only way you're going to get that into the culture is using what we do have here, which is racial divides. Historically, that's the easier way to go than class, because it's a little more recent, it's a little more fresh, it's a little more persistent in certain areas and institutions, more visible in our cities. We have this sort of de facto, it's not legal segregation, but you kind of see it with your eyes. So it's a lot easier to look at problems that still exist, call it a symptom of the system, the systemically problematic, and then come in with your solution, which is collectivist. Our solution is to, you know, empower groups, and our solution is to punish groups, and our solution to past discrimination is present discrimination. Right. How else could you sell that idea?
Right. Yeah, there was a point that you said that I was thinking about. Now I can't remember. Oh, yeah, this kind of relates to it in terms of Marxism, and a lot of it's anti-capitalism. Yeah. Like you're hearing in classes in K-12 schools and variations of anti-capitalism, socialism, like Corwin's textbook. It was literally like a socialist math textbook where they brought in all these literal political agendas that they were going to use to teach kids math, all these issues about immigration and minimum wage and, you know, systemic racism and all these things. And it wasn't neutral. They were kind of giving the kid a perspective on it in this textbook. But it's like, in my opinion, when you talk about the progress in America and viewed with all the other countries in the world. Capitalism is a great system. There's some bugs in it, but the free market is a great system, and you can advance really quickly in that system. And if you look, in my opinion, at racial progress over the last like 50 or 60 years, Robin DiAngelo says it's all about identity politics. In the very beginning of White Fragility, she's like, I believe in identity politics. And she says it, and she says most or all of the progress in the United States has come about through identity politics. And in my opinion, it's been the free market, because if you look at culture, and all the things that all these other ethnic groups and racial groups have contributed to the United States, it's because you had a free market and you were able to get it into the system. Just look at our culture in terms of like hip hop, the hip hop culture over the last like 20 years. Like, that's huge. That wasn't because of activists and identity politics. That was because of a free market, you know?
True.
So
very true.
So
I totally agree. It's identity politics is, all about a competition within the country. So it's kind of like, you know, this group want or need X, and you have to cater to our needs as a group, as opposed to saying, you know, individuals have rights and there's this barrier to us that still exists. The barrier was erected by people who had an identity issue. Okay. So we got to get rid of that, because that's not American. And when you take down that identity barrier, then we will be able to fully participate in the society, just like people who don't have that identity issue. And for a long time, that was the case. Jim Crow laws and things like that, redlining, that was a literal issue. Those things have disappeared. Now, Glenn even pointed out, I remember hearing it, he said, is it likely that the evolution or the development of skills, cognitive abilities, and, you know, wealth acquisition and all these things in the Black community has been artificially, I know people don't like this word, but it's a word, artificially sort of retarded, slowed down, because of the past, kind of like there's got to be a catch up. But I believe he made the point that is that an argument for coming in with lowered standards and all this kind of stuff, and saying you don't have to go through the development. You just, you know, and he said no. And that's where, and I've said, guys, there's no shortcut. And I wish I didn't have to say that. I wish I could say that people could just achieve and get to the place where they want to be or really ought to be right now by snapping a finger, but you won't get there that way. You won't actually be there. Okay. Right. The development still has to happen. What really we should be working on is trying to help the people who might have that, who've been sort of slowed down because of all of these things. Like you said, some of these new fangled ways of teaching reading and all this kind of junk has even hampered it further, and come in and say, all right, we need to get out of your way some more. We need to facilitate you making that developmental leap more quickly of your own effort. Because otherwise it's not real, right? It's fake. But
like that's steroids in a way.
It's the most you can do. And you're certainly not going to improve the lives of those people by stepping on the other people. Because a healthy community and a healthy country, I mean, let's look at poverty as an example. Don't people in poverty fare better if somebody out there is successful enough to want to start a business and they need to hire people? So that person in poverty isn't capable of starting the business and isn't capable of hiring a bunch of employees. But the fact that someone is facilitates their ability to lift themselves up and have a job and then rise up and move on in their life. You don't really help these people by hurting these people. In fact, you probably make their life worse.
That's a great point, because that's brought up all the time. You don't have to take away from one group or target one group in order for another group to succeed. And I've never understood that. If someone's going to check their privilege, like, what does that do to teach somebody else how to read or someone else how to have these skills? And there's never really an answer to that. So it's like, we just need to make sure that we're helping groups and not trying to target and hold other groups down or you're right. The idea that this is systemic and you need to, like, for example, target white spaces. It's like, what? I mean, you can be more inviting and you can make it more diverse, but when you're targeting and trying to disrupt, it just doesn't make sense. And it definitely doesn't bring people together. It doesn't foster communication. It doesn't, it's not, let me just say one thing about the idea, to get back to the thesis of the video, the problem or the trouble with the term white identity. to fight for this colorblind like kind of approach is something that I agree with. But it's hard to do, when you talk about people like white solidarity, saying that white people need to have solidarity, or white people need to start saying, hey, we have an identity group too. If I had my way, it would be like, all right, we're going to kind of take race off the table at least a little bit. We can keep it there, but we can kind of move past it. We can celebrate our differences and move past it. But it seems like if you try and move away from that and you try and get to colorblindness, it's forced on you so much and it's projected on you. It's like if you want to stand in the arena and have this debate, you almost have to acknowledge it, and in a way you have to almost not quite use it, but it's like if you refuse to use it, it almost seems like you're not arming yourself, or you're not having the tools to stand in the center of the debate to try and change like the thoughts, the kind of like the narrative on it. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like you can't fully just say, we're never going to talk about white identity. We're never going to acknowledge that some of this stuff in a way is anti-white. It would be great to be able to do that and just be completely like content of character. But it's like you're being forced to stand in this debate and use these terms. So I don't know how you could walk away from them. So it's like a delicate balance.
I sort of feel like the antidote might be to defuse the term white and go back to like more accurate terminology like European. And because, I mean, let's face it, there are people who are Caucasian, for example, who don't look white, but they are technically Caucasian. Right. And they're from India. Okay.
Not to cut you off, the one woman who did the Psychopathy of Whiteness, Aruna Kilanani, I thought she technically would be Caucasian, or am I wrong?
If she's from India, it's possible that she would be. So if she's speaking about phenotypically white people, so it's kind of strange. And I think the other thing is when I think about people, for example, who have strong cultural heritage, let's say Italian. Let's just pick one out of a hat, okay? And then take somebody else who has strong cultural heritage from Ireland. Okay. All right, we know people like this because both cultures come out of a Catholic tradition. Very often they'll go to the same church. Then what you see, at least when I was growing up, is I saw a lot of friends of mine who had like an Italian mom and an Irish dad, or vice versa, because that's how they met at church or something, or they met at Catholic school. But that's just how it played out. And what's interesting is they would have such strong elements of Italian culture in their home and strong elements of Irish culture in their home, and they considered themselves like those things, not white. So if you talk to them, they'd be like, I'm an Irish Italian American or whatever. And they didn't say it so much like, and you will call me that hyphen included. It was more just like almost this kind of pride of cultural heritage that now is making them something unique in America. This blend that never otherwise would have met each other. I mean, let's face it. If people had stayed in Ireland, if people had stayed in Italy, then the Italians would have married the Italians and the Irish would have 9 times out of 10, and they wouldn't have this blended, interesting culture. And so I wonder sometimes if instead we're kind of like, what it means to me that I'm not, brown or black or whatever that people are saying is their identity, is that, I'm Jewish and I'm Irish and I'm this and I'm that, because white is nothing. I mean, white is a color, right? It's not even a culture, because in America, we could talk about Western Enlightenment culture, for example, but now you're going back to ancient Greece. Would we call them white? Would we put them in the same Aristotle in the same category with like John Adams? I mean, I don't know. I really don't know. Would we? But it's all of the same kind of it's Western. But that encompasses so many ethnicities that are so different and pretty protective about their differences too. I mean, tell a Frenchman that he's just like a Spaniard or just like an Englishman, and they'll be like, "I'm sorry, what?" Right. So that maybe there's something there. Maybe there's something to just saying like what you're calling white is nothing to do with anything. We in this country, the beauty of America is that we are this melting pot of so many different kinds of cultures that have all impacted each other. I thought the dream truly was to recognize the cultures that had historically been left out of the conversation, include them more. So in other words, if European white, I mean, like that's what they want to call it, but if European ethnicities have been disproportionately represented in the literature, in the art and music and entertainment, all these kinds of things, I thought the goal was stop that. Stop doing that. Like, in other words, stop just exclusively doing that and have it just be everybody. You know, it's like we all have contributed, Native Americans, Black, Hispanic, we've all contributed to this country and to the culture that we now live in. And we might ourselves in our own lives say, well, I prefer this little chunk of the culture and I prefer this little chunk of the culture, but is it really white or Black or Hispanic or this or that? We all have things that we like. Maybe there's something to that. Instead of white identity, why don't we just go ahead and say, I have American identity and my American identity is this.
Yeah, then it doesn't work for identity politics. But you're right. That's the way it was. It seemed to be for a while, up until maybe like the last like 15 or 10 or 15 years. It seems to be getting worse. But I guess the irony is, supposedly, I guess I'm not an expert on this type of history, but I think I have a good handle on it. Europeans kind of invented like this social construct of whiteness in a way so that they could kind of keep a power structure and separate themselves from Africans or people who were considered Black. And it's like, you know, this idea of whiteness or this idea of race is an illusion, which would include whiteness and Blackness. But then you would think, okay, so the next step is let's get rid of the social construct. Let's get rid of all of these labels so that we can come together, like you said. But they do the opposite. They reinforce the whiteness and they reinforce the identity politics. And it just keeps coming back to that place, because it's about politics. It's about looking at things as systems so you can have the identity groups, because there's so much political power there. It is about power. It's all about power.
This person says, and I think she left because she said this was a waste of her time, but I'm curious. She says, white fragility is real. Please be honest instead of ignoring the facts. And so I guess my question would be, since you wrote a book about white fragility and you've studied it in depth, what do you think of that comment, that it's real and we're being dishonest?
So here's an answer. What do you mean by real? Like white fragility in terms of like tested and actually, you know, if you went through real quantitative testing on white fragility, if you looked at it in terms of a science that you could use, you know, the scientific method and have a hypothesis and use rational inquiry to try and prove something like white fragility. Because Robin DiAngelo obviously coined the phrase white fragility, and she wrote that paper, White Fragility, I think in 2011. And she was surprised when it caught on, and she did her PhD dissertation on white fragility. And then her whole concept was based on literally like 4 qualitative groups that she did. So she has this big theory that's kind of taken over race, you know, the discussion on race. And it's based on like 4 qualitative, you know, things that she did in her PhD.
Nothing quantitative.
Nothing quantitative, nothing ever studied. You cannot prove it false. It doesn't meet the principle of falsification. And the thing is, she's had all this. She incorporates her 20 years of diversity training. She was, you know, when she first started, she was doing all of this diversity training over 20 some years, and all of these defensive white people and all these white people with white fragility. And it's like, yeah, when you don't listen to a person, you don't want to communicate, you don't want to, you know, try and understand them, and you insult them, of course you're going to have this idea. It's funny because it's like, did you ever try and listen to their ideas? Did you ever try and communicate with them? Did you ever try and understand them or come to a place where you can bond? It's like, no, and no. I shut them down. They're just white. They don't understand. They don't understand the life of people of color. So this whole idea of white fragility, not only is it flawed because you've never really, in these cases where it comes up, fragility comes up when you do not want to communicate, when you shut down the lines of communication, you get this so-called fragility, but it hasn't been tested and it hasn't passed the legitimate test of, you know, quantitative analysis. It hasn't gone through any legitimate, rigorous, you know, testing. So it's pseudoscience. So white fragility is goofy.
I would so this person says, and I tend to agree, human fragility is real. People will always bite back when they're being accused of something just because of the color of their skin. I think it's true. I don't know that it's fragility per se. I mean, I know that's what she calls it, but let me put it to you a slightly different way. If somebody is saying they're insulting you based on the color of your skin, is saying, well, you just disagree with me because of this external factor I can see. They've done more than insult you. They have projected onto you something like, you know, is incredibly negative, a kind of a closed-mindedness and a lack of active thinking ability that, you know, you're an avatar for other people who look like you. You have no individuality. They've erased you. They've erased your individuality. They've erased your thought process. And if you come back at them, I think you're being incredibly generous, because if somebody talks to me that way and says, oh, well, you're just this, my first inclination, I'll be very honest with you, is to turn around and walk the F away.
Right.
Like, I don't need to waste my time engaging with you because you have just demonstrated to me that you're not a person coming to me in good faith to have a conversation, not a difficult or a courageous conversation or otherwise. You're not having a conversation. You just want to vent your spleen because you're resentful and angry. And, I have better things to do with my time. So the person who comes back and says, no, I have a different view and hear me, is actually giving you the benefit of the doubt. You're a semi-decent human being who is just being a little mistaken right now, or you're just, you're being a little pushy and bullying, but I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt that you just haven't heard my point of view, and let me tell you my point of view. And I think it's a sign that that person is actually being quite generous and willing to be vulnerable with you. They're willing to say, like, hey, no, I disagree with you. People forget that anybody who chooses to engage with you on a difficult topic such as race is making themselves vulnerable. This is not a comfortable conversation for either side. Okay. So if they choose to engage, even if they sound like they're defending themselves, even if whatever it is, they're making a choice they don't have to make. They could turn around and go and walk away. And increasingly, I will tell you, that is my take. That is what I've been doing lately. If somebody is going to come at me and go, oh, you're just this, I'm like, see ya. Because I don't have it in me anymore. I'm done. So that's not because I'm having white identity. That's because I'm having human being who is sick and tired of your BS identity, and you're not actually a good faith interlocutor. You're nobody. Goodbye. If you want to have a serious conversation about solutions, I'm happy to sit down with you. But I refuse to engage with people who just want to beat up on me as a punching bag, because that's a reflection on you. That's your fragility. That's your narcissism. That is your personality defect that you need to go find a target for your rage.
Projection.
It's 100% projection. So if somebody's going to sit there and go, oh, no, let me tell you, that's just a person who hasn't caught on to your personality disorder yet.
Yeah. Do you remember the book called 7 Habits of Highly Effective People?
Yes.
It was a big bestseller for like 10 years. Well, I remember I did this elaborate training with it because I was using it in my classroom with teens, 7 habits for highly effective teens. And the first one was be proactive, not reactive. Yeah. And these are things that go across race, religion, gender, sexuality. That's the beauty of them. They're like human, universal things. And you can argue that it can be broken down by culture, but it's ridiculous. These are things that go across identities. They transcend race and everything. So be proactive, not reactive. D'Angelo's trainings, it's all reactive. It's 100%. Not proactive. You're getting shut down. The next thing was first seek to understand and then be understood. No one seeks to understand the other side. You immediately just shut them down. They can't speak. It's literally, if you have a question or a challenge, you suffer from white fragility. That's it. And then the third one was
convenient.
Yeah. Be an active listener. Learn how to be an active listener. There's no active listening on the other side. D'Angelo is not an active listener. She doesn't want to hear about it, and she admits that. And then the other one was, there were 7 of them. Number 4 was synergy, not dichotomy, which is cooperation. You try and come together, understand people. You don't divide into groups. You don't polarize. It's not zero sum. You don't have to take away from one to give to another. All of white fragility is all about dichotomy. So the whole thing is like, no wonder there's fragility, because the whole thing is just backwards and it's just polarizing. Of course you're going to have that.
And one of the problems with it, what we said, the trouble with white identity is that if you decide to do the I can't beat him, so let's join him game of, I'm going to go ahead and have a white identity, or assume my white identity, or be proud of my white identity, or whatever the heck that is, this thing you never had growing up, but you're suddenly going to have it. Good luck with that. But I don't argue that people shouldn't do that. I don't argue. Don't mistake me as saying don't do that because it hurts minorities. Okay. I say don't do that because it hurts you. It hurts you as an individual. It's not something that's going to be constructive in your life to create, maintain, and defend an identity that actually isn't who you are. Okay. If they assign that to you, the people who are proponents of this racial essentialism, and they assign that to you, don't let them. Don't let them. If you feel like you want to go ahead and put them in their place and say, I'm not playing your little game and I'm not dancing to your little tune, by all means. Although I don't know, like you said, I don't know that like reacting is really constructive. But when you go ahead and react by doing exactly what they are doing, you are, first of all, validating what they're doing. Or why would you do it? Like, why would you do something if you think it's bad? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So now you're saying it's perfectly okay to have a racial identity, and you're making it okay for them to do, which I will never agree with.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, so forget the double standard. I don't support the double standard. Let me be very, very clear. I recognize it and I don't support it. Never did. It's just been the fact of life my whole entire life, and I can't do very much about it. But I don't agree with it. So I don't want to play tit for tat. But I'm not going to lower myself to the level of people who are so self-limiting as to say, I need to do this to protect myself. No, I don't need to do what they're doing to protect myself or my family or even my country. In fact, I think the better way to defend everything we hold dear in this country is the exact opposite, is to not take the bait. Not do that and just, like I said, sit back and be like, me, white? Like we could almost make like a little TV commercial campaign, line up, a dozen different white looking people, and then go through how incredibly different they all are and how like absurd it is to refer to them by one characteristic. It just would be kind of hilarious to really explode the myth that it is something white. You could also do a whole series on the different people who fed into Western Enlightenment culture. And would we call them white? It's like, are they specifically just white people? So I think you could blow it up in their face by educating people about the actual history and the past. And then the last thing is by consistently calling out the racism when you see it. So the one thing I will do is, if I do see people being racist against white people, okay, specifically where they're like, white people are this, okay, I'm going to call that out every single time. You're a racist. You're a racist. That's racism. Because as you put in your book, they say they can't be racist. You can't be racist against white people. Well, do we have to agree with that? No, we don't.
Right.
You don't have to agree with that.
That's a good point, because he who defines the terms controls the argument, and all the terms have been redefined overnight. You'll wake up one morning and the term is redefined.
Don't let them.
Yeah, the idea of racism, racism equals power plus privilege. Only whites have privilege, so they can only be racist, and all of these things. And when you talk about individual prejudice and discrimination, which all people can have, that's something different than racism, because there's a power dynamic. And then you talk about white supremacy culture. It used to be that white supremacy was the Klan and white nationalists. Now white supremacy is just these values that the African American Museum of History and Culture, like we talked about before, meritocracy, individualism. So the terms are redefined overnight, and it's frustrating. And now CRT is trying to be redefined, critical race theory, and that phrase that you use is perfect. It's we're not teaching critical race theory, they're using critical pedagogy, even though it's something, it could like get off of the topic. And I understand how critical race theory is this like mantra that can be used, but things are constantly being redefined. And it would be great if you could have more of a mainstream, especially in moderates and conservatives, the writers, the journalists, the people, the talking heads, they could coin terms and try and like codify and decodify, like Christopher Rufo was saying, certain language, because it is a big part of it is all about language, which is part of that whole postmodern critical race thing. Right. It's all about language. So when you're talking about, to get back to white identity, it's like, great, these are some great strategies to do, but it seems like that nuclear option is to use the phrase anti-white, because that's like the one that goes, whoa, when you say that still does have that power to it. And if you say it does have power, because if you were to go to a school board meeting and you were saying these people, this district, this school board is anti-white, like you would get something out of it. That's why identity politics is so powerful, because there's so much juice there. Right. But you don't want to.
And the thing is, but you just said something very different, though. You said this school board or this lesson or this teacher, or like you're being much more specific. If somebody is going into a classroom and saying to white children, like, whiteness is bad and white people, blah, 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 they're racist. And they're specifically being racist against white people. There's no way to sugarcoat that. That's what they're doing. That is very different from saying critical race theory is anti-white. Okay, so, and I really need to make this point, because we have to call out racism when we see it. We have to own that word. You can't. I mean, when I say own, I mean like just don't let them redefine words that have meaning. And racism is racism is racism. Forget this whole power BS that they're throwing in. If you look at other people as being, if you lump people together and stereotype them based on the color of their skin, or some race that you assign to them, you're a racist. Period. It doesn't forget whether they're powerful or powerless. Does it matter? Did it hurt Black people to have white racists when they had no power? Yes, it hurt them. It hurt them. Does it hurt somebody who's white if a group of Black people gang up on them and hurt them and whatever, and they're Black and the person's white? Yes, of course it does. You can't say that their power saved them in that moment. Racism is a terrible, evil thing. And the way we know that it runs across race is we have situations like this point that was made. This woman is, have you ever heard of her, Africa Brooke?
No, I've not.
Okay. So she's been discovered. I guess the Free Black Thought folks on Twitter discovered her, and she's got so many kernels of wisdom here. But this is never forget that you have every right to question any individual, system, movement, or group that only tolerates you when you think and behave like them.
Yeah.
And that's, you don't have to second guess yourself about calling somebody a racist because the society allegedly has more power in the hands of people that look like you. No, racism is racism. And I'm going to call it out every single time I see it and call it what it is. But that's different. What you just said about the school board is very different than calling the theory or the whole pedagogy or whatever. And I know people don't like that level of nuance anymore. They kind of want to grab onto something and be like, it's this. Yeah. But it's not that simple. It's just not that simple. And they want you to do that. They want you to do that. They want you to glom onto that, because then they'll come back, the proponents of this stuff, whenever I say they, that's what I'm talking about. They'll come back and they'll say, with the white fragility, white tears, you just are afraid of losing your white power. That argument doesn't really hold weight when you're pointing at a specific person and their specific words. If I say Mark Lamont Hill was out of control racist in talking to Chris Rufo, when he said, what's one good thing you like about being white? I mean, like, who talks like that? And the test is, could you flip it around and say the identical thing and substitute Black? And if the answer is, oh my God, no.
Yeah, the double standard is so thick. That's one of the most ridiculous things about it. You could take this and flip it around, the double standard, every single time. And here's another irony about this. When you're talking about empowerment, like real power, like my mantra is, to a certain extent, all change is self-change. If you work on things at the individual level to the point where you can, because obviously there's some systems and things in place, but if you work on it at an individual level, you're going to get the most out of it. And when you look at things, I just lost my train of thought.
That happens. But no, you're right. All change is individual change.
Right. All change is self-change. And man, I lost that last one. I can't remember.
But you bring up something important, because the video I made right before we got together was talking about social emotional learning. And the premise of social emotional learning is that we're going to get in the school and we're going to basically parent the kids. We're going to teach them about empathy and all this stuff. And that's going to go back into the community. And that is just not how it works. Right. The community and how people are parenting their children and interacting with each other, whatever, that comes into the school. And I'm sure you see that in your work when you're teaching, that what comes into the building each day is a reflection. It's a microcosm of what's outside the building. Sure. This idea that you have so much power, Chris, you're going to.
Oh, you know what? Thank you. I remember now. You're right. The chicken or the egg, is it the community that is it the school? Is it the community that controls the school, or the school that influences the community? It's like the chicken and the egg. But here was my point about power. True power is when you become self-empowered. And the idea about systems with critical race theory and the critical pedagogy that's being taught, it's almost as if, like we said, another group has to be deconstructed or targeted in order for this group to succeed. It's like, if you're depending on the actions of other groups, you're not self-empowered. That's the ultimate white supremacy that's being talked about. It's like, are you individually self-empowered and the captain of your own ship to a certain point? Yes or no? If you're not, then it's over. It's over then at that point,
And I think too that, when we think of people who were literally discriminated against, enslaved, then discriminated against, or treated as second-class citizens, whatever, one of the things I think that animates their hopes on a daily basis when they're in that kind of existence is, I just want what the free people have. Like, I don't necessarily want more. I just want to live. I want to be left alone to live my life and nobody get in my way and tell me I can't because of something I couldn't control. So for generations of people who were, like I said, literally in bondage and then different levels of discrimination, their goal was to live under the Constitution as free and equal people. Right. Individually pursuing their own dreams, which, by the way, put them ahead of the game from people in Africa at the same time, who certainly couldn't do that. And in much of Africa, even to this day, don't necessarily have the same civil rights that we have in this country. And why we would say, no, in order to liberate these people, we have to dismantle this Constitution that their great grandparents and grandparents and everybody were like, I just want that to apply to me too. Nope, we're going to get rid of it just in time for you to get here. We're going to get rid of it and we're going to do away with equality under the law, or we're going to have everybody, instinctively think that you got this position because of the color of your skin, because of some affirmative action. Where that seems to me to be incredibly racist and incredibly limiting, and deprives people of their individual agency and their freedom. Quite literally, it infantilizes and re-enslaves them.
Just like Glenn Lowry says and John McWhorter. I really love listening to what they say about that. It's interesting about that. And what you were saying, man, I can't believe it. I must be getting tired. Like I just had another thing to slip through.
Is your AC kicking out now? It's like, oh God.
Yeah, yeah, go ahead. It'll come back to me. It'll come back to me.
Well, no, I mean, I think the main thrust of wanting, the reason I wanted to get together and talk about this was like I said, I wanted to have a nuanced conversation about the issue of identity politics, the issue of identity, the issue of white identity specifically, because it's been such a hot button issue. And people have gotten really frustrated when you say things like critical race theory is not anti-white, because they're like, but it is. And you're like, yes, but, and it's a lot longer conversation than fits into a tweet.
Sure. I remember what I wanted to say. It's kind of off point. It's about what you were talking about. It's interesting when immigrants come to the United States, how they are very much like pro-American, pro-Constitution. Yeah. It's amazing to see it, especially at school board meetings. I did a video of the school board meeting at the Tredeffrin Easttown School Board, and there were these Chinese American immigrants, like 5 or 6 of them. Literally, English is a second language, and they were explaining their home country and China and communism, and it was amazing. It was inspiring to see how proud they were and how great that they thought the country was. And then you can argue, oh, well, an immigrant coming into the country is different from someone born here who's been under the oppressive, systemically racist country for so long. But if you look at the people coming from these countries,
from El Salvador,
right? You're coming from war-torn countries with all kinds of poverty and everything, and it's like. It's a shame because you have to look at the country. You can see its flaws, but you need to look at it in a way where you see all of the opportunities, all the amazing opportunities that are here. And when you see it through this lens, the critical pedagogy lens, when the kids are seeing it like this, and the new teachers, the teachers who are becoming new teachers to these kids, and it's this oppressive system that's dripping in systemic racism. It was purposefully designed. I hate that. It was purposefully designed to hold people of color back. That's what they're saying.
I think they're getting a whole lot of credit. They're giving a whole lot of credit to people of the past, not just for being super sinister and evil, but also to being skillful. That's actually quite skillful. I mean, there are people alive today. We know some of their names, Mark Lamont Hill, Joy Reid, whatever, who would love nothing more than to craft a system that specifically held back their enemies, right? But without coercion, without literal coercion, it's incredibly difficult to do in a free market society, or even even a mixed economy setup. It's incredibly difficult when you have the Bill of Rights and freedom of speech and certain things, how you could create a system that coexisted with our Bill of Rights that was intentionally designed to hold people back. I think you can create systems that, shall we say, exploit people's weaknesses or exploit their ignorance and their lack of understanding of, for example, wealth creation and education and things like that. I think you could do that. I think that Lyndon Johnson did do that. But is that the same thing as saying the Constitution was created to hold people? Like they go all the way with these ideas. They don't just look at a specific policy. And I find that very interesting because I would love to ask the same people who will say they created this to hold people back. I'm like, okay, can we have a chat about the Great Society programs and public school itself? Do you think they chose, like, explain why you think they chose whole word reading and, like look-say method and 3Q method? Why do you think they chose that over phonics and the science of reading? And even though the results were like this, why have they not switched back? Can we have a chat about whether that might be intentional? Oh, of course not. That was not intentional. That's just, why are you so paranoid and conspiracy theorist, whatever. I'm like, I'm a conspiracy theorist. You're literally saying the Bill of Rights was concocted to hold people back. Yeah. It seems kind of ridiculous.
Obviously, historical racism has an effect, and there are obviously flaws. But I think you were the one that said this. If it were truly this systemically racist country as it's made out to be, then nobody would be pushing these policies and having these conversations and bending over backwards to do everything that they can to make it right, to make up for it. It wouldn't look anything like the country it does now.
No, we wouldn't have had a black president for 8 years. We wouldn't be afraid of canceling. If we were a white supremacist country and somebody said, you can't read case law, like an actual case from history that has the N-word in it, okay? And you wouldn't be able in a college class or a law school class to read that aloud and say, well, the blah, 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 he needs to be kicked out of school. He just read a word from an actual case, from actual case law, but he enunciated the word and he's white. We have to kick him out. Right. If this were a white supremacist country, good luck with that. They'd look at you and be like, I'm sorry, what? Like, why are you here again? You're not supposed to be here. Get out. Like, this is utterly ridiculous. And yet they say these ridiculous things and people don't challenge it. So I guess my answer to those who say, well, if we can't beat them, we have a right to join them. It's a double standard. It's not fair. I want to assert my white identity is, why don't you want to assert your American identity? Right. Why are we still apologizing for being Americans? Why are we still so hesitant to be patriotic? And why do we equate patriotism with this jingoistic red, white, and blue, I approve of everything my country does at all times? Patriotism can simply mean, I believe in the ideas and the foundational principles of this country. And those are, and you can list them off. I don't believe in the geography. I don't believe in any specific race. I don't believe in all the decisions my government makes are perfect, or I don't believe specifically in the military. I just believe in these ideas and I'm going to defend them. And I identify as American and I'm going to defend my American identity. And you can call me names all day long, but I'm very proud of it. And I wish you were too, because there is a very powerful legacy you can pass on to your children of being American. And we can work together to make this a great country that's better than it was before. But if you're so ashamed of this country and you don't want to be American, I can't help you. I do. I want to be American. I'm proud of my American identity. And I'm going to wave that flag very high, not because it's a flag or magic sky cloth, but because it represents those ideas I just said to you. So I'm okay with that kind of identitarianism. And like I said, it's not a jingo thing. It's, I believe in these ideas and that's my identity and I'm not letting it go. And the great thing about it is you could be any race, you could be any religion, you could be any, male, female, trans, gay, it doesn't matter. If you are proud of the ideas and it's not even partisan. That's the identity that we should be proud of and we should be trumpeting, not color. Right.
Yeah, I think there should be a balance with everything. And I don't have a problem when you look at things systemically and you can look at patterns. Like I said, I'm more individual and I think change at that level is more powerful. And if you could balance those kind of 7 habits and those things and those skills that these kids can learn, and then they can look at some systems and you can look at how historical racism, and maybe there is some institutional racism going on in certain places. And
in the school.
Yeah. And actually, and in a way, it's like, you're right, against marginalized groups in certain situations, but that's fine with me. You can have both as long as you can look at everything in balance. But the whole, as we know, when it comes to this critical pedagogy, critical race theory, if you disagree, like a person just said, white fragility is real. You're either a racist or you're an anti-racist. You either believe in all the things that Kendi speaks or you're a racist. And that's the idea that it's intolerant and this kind of an intolerance.
We just need to get I really believe that we need to be a lot better informed about things like personality disorders, antisocial behaviors,
Universal things.
Yeah, because what we're seeing and what we're allowing and what we're trying to respond to with equally toxic ideas, in my personal opinion, I think if you take on a racial identity, you're letting some very toxic people set the narrative. So I would rather have people say, I think it's sad that you see yourself as a color or a race or a gender or whatever. I'm sad for you because I have a much more nuanced and complex view of myself, and I'm happy. And it doesn't seem like you're happy for all of this labeling that you've done, for all of this, identifying that you've done. You seem really attached to having me feel a certain way before you can.
When you get a lot of your pleasure from your identity, it's like the cover of a book. It's like if you're really focused on your identity and you're getting the pleasure out of the superficial identity, it's like, oh man, the cover of this book is beautiful. I don't really need to open the book and read it. It's really superficial. It's limited. It's a shame when you get caught up in identities in that way. But the one thing I will say, to get back to the thesis of this with white identitarianism and the problem with it, I think you're right. You need to be careful with it. You need to make sure that depending on the situation, how you use it. I do think that there's times that you can use it and times that you can't. And I think that when you get to a place, it's almost like the reverse. When racism is gone, now, according to the proponents of CRT, when racism is truly gone, then we can take race off the table. But until then, we have to keep race on the table, which is going to be forever because it's really about politics and it's identity politics. And that's where it's coming from. But if you can say, once we can get past identity politics, then this idea of white people, whiteness, white space, targeting whiteness, it can go away. So in a way, it's like, don't just see yourself as white and get caught up in this white solidarity and get caught up in this segregation. But there is a time when you can say that we need to address it, because in order to stand in the middle of this arena and have this conversation and have this debate, you do need to call it out, and you do need
definitely
to expose it. You know what I mean?
I'm not going to not call it out. And that's like, that's the one thing that, I don't think there's anything to be gained by pretending that people who are doing this are not only racist, they're not generic racist. They're a specific kind of racist, and we should call it out as such, because that also it frames the definition of racism the correct way, which is, overt actions and beliefs and behaviors of individuals towards other individuals, stereotyping, and those kind of things that we have traditionally known of as racism. Right. This notion that racism is any outcome I don't like, that happens to align or correlate in a way that I drew the graph with race equals racism, or is evidence of racism somewhere. That is bad science. That is junk science. And it's being used for political purposes. All
racial disparities are the sole result of racism. All racial disparities are the sole result of systemic racism. These disparities are so complex, and there's so much that you need to do to solve problems and to help people. And it's lazy. It's like, it's just systemic racism. And that's why. It's terrible.
It creates excuses. It creates cover-ups. It doesn't hold the correct people accountable. You're making the entire society, people had nothing to do with the academic outcomes of these kids, and you're making them responsible for those academic outcomes. It's very interesting to me when teachers are and are not held accountable for student outcomes. It seems to be awfully, no offense, but it seems to be awfully conveniently tied to politics.
Right.
Because I see teachers get held accountable for things that are totally not their fault. And it usually is a function of there's nothing politically to be gained from covering it up. Maybe they're even being exploited for political gain and so forth. So I just don't want people to think that you have to identify to call it out, or conversely, that calling it out makes you a white supremacist. So if anybody says, you called something anti-white, that means you're a white supremacist. I'm like, no.
Right.
Because not all white identitarianism, and they are people who say, I'm a white identitarian. I want a white identity. I want to have a white affinity group. I want to do this. Those people are not necessarily supremacist. Just like there are people in Black affinity groups who are not Black supremacists. Black supremacists exist. White supremacists exist. Black separatists exist. White separatists exist. These people exist, all these little subgroups. But somebody who says, I want to identify as white is not necessarily a supremacist. That doesn't mean I agree with them. It just means to automatically associate them with I think I'm better than someone is not true either. I think people are saying that and doing that out of a sense of protection, like defense.
Yeah.
Like I feel like I got to do this because if I don't, then somehow I'm more at risk, or I'm vulnerable, and my kids are vulnerable, and my community is vulnerable. And I would just like to say, I'd rather we spit it back in their face and say, I'm sorry that you are so anti-American, but I'm an American. And what you said was anti-white, but what you're doing is anti-American. So there's kind of like that subtle difference. Right.
Yeah, I agree with you. And it's funny because when you start talking about American identity and American national culture and anti-American, that gets hammered. Then they start hammering you as being racist and all of that stuff. There's an answer for everything with this, and it goes in circles, and it's all semantics, and it's all redefining the terms, and it's political, and there's an agenda. And
that's why you have to know what you believe. Like what you just said, Chris, before about the 7 habits.
Yeah.
The great thing about the 7 habits is it gives you a system. It gives you personally as an individual a set of principles that, whether you do that or you have a philosophy or, a religion, whatever it is, know thyself. So start with yourself. Like you said, all change is self-change. Start with yourself. Like, what do I believe about me, about this country, do I believe the country is good, is a force for good, or do I believe it is inherently racist? Be real solid in that. And then all the word games in the world and all the stuff they say is not going to change who you are. And it will inform how you can react and still have your integrity and not play their game. You're living your agenda, not theirs. The trouble with white identity is that's their agenda.
Yeah, it's a good difference when you talk about principle or value-based and identity-based. That's something that I was talking about previously. When you're principle-based and it's about you and your values, that's a core foundation to have as like a compass. You're principle-based, you're moral-based, or are you identity-based? If you're principle-based, it's very consistent. It's very easy to understand what are your values, what are your morals and principles, which transcend race and all the identities. Or are you identity-based? And if you talk about this white identitarianism, it does start to become identity-based to a certain point. But there is a time and a place for it. But I see what you're saying.
Well, the time and the place is when it's not so much about your identity, the time and the place to call them out as being specifically anti-white, in my opinion, is when they are being explicitly and specifically anti-white. And then you call them racists. And if they say, well, how can I be a racist? Like you just said, white people this, white people that, and they go, oh no, white people, I can't be racist. But well, actually you can, and you are. And this isn't up for debate. This is a fact. And, when you hold an entire group guilty as charged because of something they had no control over, that is literally the definition of racism. And the other thing that this gives you, this principle-based framework, is it makes having to deal with any of their BS, whether you have to go to a training or whatever, for me, I picture myself in a DEI training with Robin DiAngelo. And I actually think I would have to contain myself to stop from laughing. I know a lot of people would dread it. A lot of people would be like, oh my God, I want to make a say, what I'm going to do. And I would actually I would be probably wanting to giggle and chuckle and whatever. And if she said, why are you laughing? I'm like, this is absurd. Like, this is utterly ridiculous. She said, well, that's your white fragility talking. But like, nope. Yeah. It's not. And I'm very sorry that you're such a white supremacist. But I'm not. I have better things to do with my time, so I'm going to go now. But good luck with it. Good luck with your white supremacy. And I would leave because she is a white supremacist.
Sure, absolutely, she is.
It. I would laugh though; it wouldn't affect me. It wouldn't touch me one bit.
Her belief in her power and white people's power, like the supreme power that they supposedly have, is totally like a projection of her white supremacy. And to talk about like getting back to colorblindness, and it comes down to semantics and definitions and not playing the game and using the words. You made a good point when you're talking about implicit bias and microaggressions and systemic things. The old terms, the terms that everybody could identify with, that were right there on the surface that you could see and prove, actual discrimination, actual prejudice, actual ideas. That's what it's all about. That's what racism is, and that's what it is. And we need to get back to that because arguing over a microaggression or an implicit bias or something in the system is not, you can't pin it down. It's too vague. And it just creates this situation where you can't control the rules. It's heads I win, tails you lose type thing. And it's just That's another thing where we got to get back to controlling the semantics, especially with the microaggressions, because it's like communication is a two-way street. It's absolutely a two-way street. When people communicate, it's a giver and a receiver. And it's like, you can't just say the way that you gave this was wrong. Maybe the way you received it was wrong, or maybe we need to figure out why this happened, but it's a microaggression and it's only your fault and only you can do it. What kind of communication is that? What kind of a way to
what are we teaching children when we don't teach them the most important lesson? I would say the most important, but one of the most important lessons that I was taught as a child is the only thing I truly have control over is my reaction to things. Mm-hmm. So that's 100% in my control. And in order to mature, you have to get a better and better handle on that. It's not easy. No one's going to say it's easy. Self-control can be difficult, especially when people are really provoking you and pushing your buttons. But that's your goal of adulthood, is that other people can't do that to you, that they don't control you, that you control you. And what to me is sort of sad is the same people going, we need liberation. We need to be liberated. We need to be liberated. I get my feelings.
But they're completely controlled by everybody.
You've literally handed over control of your mental health to somebody's gaze, the colonial gaze,
the white gaze.
The white gaze. And I'm like, really? I mean, this is so ridiculous. And what people are projecting is I'm a terrified, weak, insecure, hollow, shallow, fragile creature, and I can't stand it, so I'm going to project it onto you. So I guess my message to people is, if you're sort of tempted to go with the racial identity thing, hold up a second and realize that all those people being nasty and insulting you, whatever, they are broken, fragile, probably mentally ill people. I don't suggest you feel sorry for them. I just suggest you see them as what they are. And the only power they have over you or your feelings is that which you give them. And why would you allow them to suck you into their vortex of identity politics? We used to be people who were sort of center rightish, whatever. We're always of the like, don't hyphenate me. I don't want to play in your hyphenated world. I'm an American. I'm all for that. Like, why did we give that up so quickly? Let's stick to that. That's kind of my message. The trouble with the identity is it's their game, not yours.
Yeah. Do you remember a book called Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl? Did you ever hear of that?
Yes, I have heard of that book. I haven't read it, but I've heard of it.
Okay. He was in a concentration camp, and he realized the only thing that he could control out of all the things, like literally in a concentration camp, the only thing he could control was his reaction to what was happening, his attitude. No one could take that away from him, because he could control how he reacted to a situation and in his attitude. And that's interesting, because if you look at a situation, obviously I'm not trying to make comparisons to something like the Holocaust, which is, ridiculous, but it's like, even in that kind of a situation, there's still some agency that an individual has, and they have a certain attitude, and they can really decide how they want to react to a situation.
Right. Grit, resilience, resourcefulness. If we want our kids to survive in this world, whatever's coming, the last thing we should want to be doing is teaching them to be hypersensitive and neurotic about, how people are looking at them and how people are acting towards them. We should be teaching them to care less. I'm not saying be cynical and dismissive and antisocial. I'm saying just don't care as much.
Have thicker skin.
Yeah. I mean, and it sounds cliche, but we live in a world of how many likes. Okay.
Yeah, right.
And when you go into school and your teachers are teaching you like to be aware of all your biases and second guess yourself constantly and check this and check that and look at how people are treating you and this means that and what's your lived experience, what's your feelings. Where in social emotional learning, in my video I did today, I read an article by this woman who said she has a basket of colored bracelets. Red, green, and yellow. And the kids come in and they put on the bracelet to alert everyone else in the class how they're feeling that day, to literally wear their feelings on their sleeves. And they have a breathing bucket where they're like, if they need to get over their problems, they go and breathe into the bucket. And I'm like, what are you role modeling for these children?
Yeah.
You're literally role modeling fragility, hypersensitivity, and neuroticism. Sure. Why would you do that?
Sure. Yeah.
It's just crazy. So anyway, I think we probably covered this. I mean, what's your final word though? Do you feel like you can say confidently that white identitarianism is kind of a bad way to go, is not the direction we want to go? Or do you think that it's understandable and maybe people could do that and it would be okay still?
I always say in moderation and in balance, like we said, the fight should be for the traditional Martin Luther King colorblindness. You try and get past, you acknowledge the differences, you celebrate them, you try and get past them to the content, which naturally happens anyway. Right. It organically happens. That's the goal. And I think anybody who really cares about unity and progress, that's the goal. A lot of people would agree with that.
Sure.
When you stand inside this arena of identity politics, because identity politics are here and they're dripping, they're there. I mean, so when you have to go into the fray of identity politics, then that's where this white identity thing crops up, where you might have to say, as a way to debate and defend, or as a way to maneuver, I might have to use this in this situation to navigate and try and move past. Like, we want to move past identity politics. So in order to do that, we might need to use this identity. We might need to put it on to help move past it in the identity politics arena. But when you're outside the identity politics arena, I think values-based, principles-based, American culture, American values, this more holistic thing is the right way to go.
So let me see if I understand what you're saying. So when you're in a debate with somebody and it's clearly in the identity politics realm, and that would be the time to say, okay, yeah, I'm a white woman. I'm a white woman. And so because whatever that means, but here's what it means to me. It doesn't really mean anything to me. It obviously means something to you, but I'm certainly not going to deny reality. I'm a white female, a white cisgendered, heterosexual white female, whatever you want to call it. And I mean, in other words, not pretend that I'm not that,
to use it to expose, like to call out, to use it to expose the anti-white things that are going on. Like, to me, it's like you take on the white identity as a way to expose anything that's racist or that's like anti-white. You don't have to say, look, we need white solidarity. We need to protect white culture. We need to resegregate. I need to get out of this neighborhood. I need to be around, an all white neighborhood. Like that stuff is like, whether or not people get resentful and it organically happens. I don't think you want to do that. I don't think you need to say, like, certain people are really proud of being Irish or Italian and great. I'm Irish. I don't know necessarily you need to go out there and say I'm white like that. But I think that you can acknowledge that because this social construct is used in identity politics and it has in certain cases become anti-white, I think you can use that phrase in certain situations to stay in the battle of identity politics, to move past it to something deeper. But in your normal everyday life, like your political soapbox, you could use it. And then your interpersonal real life, I wouldn't go there with it.
Well, I'll say, here's a couple of examples in the brutal honesty space. Okay. Here are some examples that have occurred to me where I have gotten inside my own head and thought to myself, like, okay, you are white and that is coloring your, like, here's an example. When I look at some of the people who are out there, let's say rioting, looting, whatever, for Black Lives Matter, or they're twerking on the side of an ambulance right adjacent to a shooting site or whatever. And I don't, if you want to call it a privilege, one thing that I don't have to do, that I imagine plenty of Black people do feel like they might have to do, is I don't have to disavow that. I don't have to look at that and say, that's not part of my culture, or I don't agree with that, or that's not something I subscribe to. I would have to do that if the KKK were marching down the street, perhaps, or if, something else that was so very obviously predominantly being done by white people and so very obviously antisocial behavior, then I would feel that way. But I would say for most of the things that are going on right now, I don't have to look, like even Antifa. They're like 99% white, right?
Yep.
I don't look at that, even though I'm white, I don't look at that and go, ooh, I feel embarrassed as a white person. They're out there representing white people. They're carrying around a White Lives Matter. But like, then I'd be ashamed. I'd be like, But I think sometimes about people who are Black, who see Black Lives Matter people out there doing their thing and doing stuff that maybe they don't agree with. And I think to myself, I'm not going to lie. I feel privileged that I don't have to worry about owning that or not owning that.
Sure.
That's not to do with me. And I'm just being honest. I'm just telling you straight up, like, we might as well be brutally honest here, that that's not my burden to deal with. I don't have to care about it. You
want to hear a white privilege here that I'll admit to, since you bring it up? In in today's culture, it's kind of not quite like this, but it is in a way. If you're a Black conservative, like if you're an African American who wants to represent conservative values, or you're more of a Republican, there's the pressure there to go with racial solidarity. And it's one of the toughest things, it seems to me, if you're an African American or person of color, especially a Black conservative, that's tough. And it's like, I think for the most part, I can be a conservative or a moderate or whatever, even though in today's culture, it's still, it's more progressive, and conservatives, I think, get more of a bad rap.
You can hide.
Yeah.
Point is, you could keep your politics, you could keep your politics private.
Yeah.
And part of why you can do that, and part of why I can do that, is that we're white.
Yeah, like Tim Scott, like Uncle Tim, you know what I mean? Like that's horrendous. That's disgraceful.
Exactly.
And that happens all the time, and it's ridiculous. And it's like, come on, man. Like as Joe Biden would say, come on, man. It's not right.
It's not assumed. I mean, it is regionally. So like, for example, when I used to live in Massachusetts or even in New York, it was automatically assumed I'd be progressive Democrat because everybody else was. But I don't think that so much had to do with race as it had to do with just region, like where I lived, or maybe what kind of education I had, that people would assume my politics. And, it didn't have to do with race. But I think if you're Black, people do tend to assume your politics. They assume a lot of things about you. That is, I admit, it's a privilege that I don't have to deal with people making as many assumptions about my politics.
That you're a monolith,
Yeah, and politically.
Yeah, politically.
The flip side of that is, I do wonder when I go out, for example, especially if I'm, my neighborhood is very, very diverse. Okay, I would say my neighborhood is, if it's not 50-50, I'd be surprised. Okay, but it's definitely not majority white. It's like it's a very big mix of people. And there are times that I have walked past my neighbors' homes, who are Black, and I have them on like either side of me. And I don't know them personally, but I don't know any of my neighbors. I'm not a very friendly person. I'm very introverted. So I go out and I'm walking past, and I'll nod because it's the South. So we nod and we wave and, hi, how are you? Or your garden looks beautiful, whatever the usual neighborly things to say. But it crosses my mind, like, does he dislike me? Like, this literally, the thoughts go through my head of like, do they mistrust me? Do they dislike me? Do they think that I'm a racist? Like, these thoughts, I never used to think like that. These thoughts are now going through my mind because of everything that's been going on. And that is something that I do now. And I do it because of the disparity that in our races. And I never did it before.
You know what's interesting about that, and I've mentioned it in the book, in the end of the book. It's like, it seems like identity politics and the identity-based view is more cerebral, and there's more like mind. There's more chatter in the mind. It's like very much all this mental thought going around. Like, instead of interacting, like you can interact with people from kind of your gut and like your heart, where you just go with it, and it's like a more personable, like deeper level. But when it's this, it seems like with this critical pedagogy and these microaggressions, implicit biases, constantly vigilant over everything. It's like your mind's going, you're thinking of things. It's this mental chatter. You're not in the moment as much. You can't connect as much. And I think that that's an issue, because you're right, because it's happened to me too. For long periods of time, it's funny. Like when I'm during the school year, I'm with my kids, I'm with the students, the athletes, I'm interacting, parents, and it's like I'm kind of in a different place. And then I'll go home for the summer for a break. And then, even though my neighborhood's pretty diverse, but again, I don't have a whole lot of relationships in terms of different people all the time. But it's like I'll do the same thing as you. Like, I'll start to think things, and I'll start to look at things through the lens of race. Like, everything, it's becoming racialized. I don't look at things through this lens of race in normal situations, but then I'll find myself racializing and looking through the lens of race, and it's uncomfortable. And it's like, I understand that you need to see things so that we can end racism. There's a certain point to looking at systems and patterns so that we can make sure that there's not unhealthy patterns or racism.
Right. And but I don't like to do that. Exactly. I've noticed it. And the only reason I've mentioned it is it's something new. It's something I've never done before. And then, like I said, there'll be people who say, well, you never did that before, you never had to do it. And I'm like, I don't think anyone should have to do it. I don't think anyone should have to do it in America. I think the dream that at least I have for myself, for my children, and I would hope other people have too, is that we don't have to do it, period. We could just walk around our neighborhood and just be like, hey, person, totally. And that's new in the past couple of years. So that is something that I notice. And I'm not the type of person who changes where I go. I don't change what neighborhoods I go to. I don't do anything like that based on race or fear or anything like that. I mean, I only do it based on crime. I'll do it based on crime because some neighborhoods are just not safe to go to.
Sure.
But it's not because of race.
Right.
And
exactly.
I just see that more and more people, I'm guessing, are operating with higher degrees of fear and animosity than before. And that's the only time that I start to go, oh yeah, you're white. You know what I mean? Like, that's the only time it'll be like conscious of my whiteness, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because other than that, I'm just walking through life and doing whatever. And people say, well, that's your privilege. And I'm like, maybe it is, but I don't want to give that up. No, that privilege I don't want to give up. And I want it for you too. Like, that's the difference. It's not a privilege that I'm trying to hold on to exclusively for myself.
Yeah. You want to give it to somebody.
I don't even think it's a privilege. I think it's a human right to just be able to move around the planet.
What's the difference? What's the difference between rights and privileges? That's a great point. It's like, if that's a privilege, we need to make it a right. And it's like, you don't need to take someone's privilege away. No. You need to make sure that everybody has it.
Yeah,
it's like, let's make sure everybody has that.
I want everyone to be able to walk around the world and walk around certainly their country, if you're an American, without feeling like conscious of that. So if people are telling me, well, I get in my car and I drive and I'm more conscious about the police pulling me over, et cetera, because I'm Black, or I'm worried about my children because they're Black. And they're right. I can't, if that's true or a serious, concern or whatever, that I cannot necessarily relate to. Although I will say that I think people downplay the level of anxiety that everyone has about police. Like this notion that that's exclusively racial is like, no, I'll be honest with you, I'm afraid of the police.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm not super confident when it comes to getting pulled over by the police. It scares the living daylights out of me. So it's just, I guess the culture says, and the news media and everything say, you need to be more afraid. No, you're right. I can't relate to that, but I don't want you to have to deal with that either. Sure, I want police reform. I don't want anyone to deal with that. So this idea of privilege, like, check your privilege, is like, I'm conscious, I'm aware of it, but I want you to have the same ability. Don't tell me that I should be conscious of my whiteness. Like, why? I don't want you to have to be conscious of your Blackness. It shouldn't be, it shouldn't matter. But unfortunately, here we are.
If you have values, if you have this value-centered thing, like all the things we talk about, being proactive instead of reactive, being a good listener, seeking first to understand, then be understood, synergy, and these values, you wouldn't need to keep race on the table to see racism, and it would be a more, I think, inclusive place, and it would be better communication. Yeah. So
Yeah, it would be, and I don't know. I guess that would be like a good place to end, because I think, I don't know. What do you think?
We covered it pretty thoroughly. Yeah,
I think we did. And and you've got to be getting some pretty warmed up in there with your HTV.
Starting to heat up here.
All right. Thank you so much, Chris. So to the audience, thank you for coming. Thank you for listening. I hope we've given you some things to think about. Obviously, your mileage may vary. You'll decide what you'll do. I just, I'm not going to say like nobody should do this or that. I just hope that we can remember what it is to be American, and that we are all Americans. That's all. That's kind of my hope. Maybe it's a little naive or, childish or something, but that's how I feel. So
makes sense.
All right. Thank you, Chris. Thanks everybody for watching.
Thanks for having me.
Take it easy.